Good afternoon. I'm Charlotte Cummins, Director of Education and Programs. On behalf of MMoCA staff and Board of Trustees, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual celebration of Michelle Handelman, These Unruly and Ungovernable Selves. A multimedia and performance artist, Michelle Handelman creates film installations that draw on her life experiences and those of her performers to confront life and death, pain and pleasure. 2 film installations will be on view inside the Imprint Gallery through August 15th. In addition, a new video trilogy, the Pandemic series, is available in its entirety on our website, MMoCA.org. Thank you to our members, supporters, community partners, and corporate sponsors. I am delighted to introduce you to Elizabeth Shoshany Anderson. Shoshany Anderson is the Assistant Curator at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art and the Lead Curator of Arts and Literature Laboratory, a community-driven contemporary nonprofit arts organization. Before joining MMoCA in the summer of 2019, Shoshany Anderson was Curator of Exhibitions and Collections at the Miller Art Museum in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. Shoshany Anderson was previously based in London, where she held a curatorial internship with the Tate Modern. Shoshany Anderson received her master's in curating the art museum from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and a BA in art history and Jewish studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now I will hand this over to Elizabeth Shoshany Anderson.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. The exhibition, Michelle Handelman, These Unruly and Ungovernable Selves, was organized by students enrolled in the art history course, Design Thinking for Exhibitions at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in consultation with the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art's curatorial team. Stemming from a shared interest in utilizing museum spaces for direct learning, this cross-institutional venture seeks to cultivate the next generation of museum professionals by introducing participants to the practical and theoretical matters of curation. The course is led by Professor Anna Campbell. I'm joined tonight by 2 of the student organizers of the exhibition, Becca Owens and Maeve Hogan, who I will briefly introduce. Becca Owens is a PhD student in art history and an MA student in gender and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They received a BA in art history, visual culture, and queer studies from Sarah Lawrence College in 2018. Becca's work focuses on modern to contemporary art and visual culture, queer and trans theory, curation and museums, and institutional critique. Becca curated Gender Euphoria, Contemporary Art Beyond the Binary for Five Oaks Museum, which can be viewed online on the museum's website. In addition to being part of the class that organized Michelle Handelman's exhibition, Becca also works as a gallery attendant at MMoCA. Maeve Hogan is a PhD student in design history and the Jane Graff Fellow in the Helen Louise Allen Textile Collection at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research focuses on craft and domestic material culture as they relate to modernity, nostalgia, and narratives surrounding identity. Prior to UW-Madison, Maeve was a curatorial associate at the New York Historical Society and an instructor at the New York School of Interior Design. She holds an MA in Decorative Arts, Design History, and Material Culture from the Bard Graduate Center and a BA in Art History from Clark University. This event will take the form of a question and answer session and conversation between myself, Becca, and Maeve about the exhibition. If you have questions at any point, please put them into the comments section and I will be sure to pass them on to Becca and Maeve. So let's begin with a brief dialogue and some conversation about the process of forming the exhibition that's currently on view at MMoCA. Would one of you, Becca or Maeve, like to just start us off by explaining sort of the different elements of this exhibition, what you can physically see in the gallery at MMoCA, what you can see online, and how those elements play out?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So the exhibition is installed on view on the second floor of MMoCA, and there's 2 different screens that are playing works. One of them is inside the Imprint Gallery, and that's playing Irma Vep, The Last Breath, which is a longer video piece by Michelle Handelman. And then outside on the landing is a monitor that's playing a shorter piece called Candyland. In addition to those 2 video pieces, there is a series of 3 works that's available for viewing on the MMoCA website, which is called the Pandemic series. So those are 3 shorter pieces by Michelle Handelman. And we'll also be having an event in early May that will be showing clips of another work by Michelle called Dorian, a Cinematic Perfume. So 2 videos actually on view in the museum, and then a selection of online content that can be viewed remotely as well.
And how did the concept for this exhibition emerge as part of this course?
So the artist was selected by Anna Campbell, our professor, and then the works were selected through a collective process amongst me and our classmates. So we viewed a ton of Michelle's work, her earlier works, her longer pieces, more recent works, and then worked in iterations of proposals. So working both individually and collaboratively with other students in the class, coming up with groups of videos that we thought would be well suited to be shown together, reviewing those proposals as a group, as a class group, refining them, submitting second drafts of them, and then ultimately sending those proposals to the team at MMoCA and to Michelle herself for approval. So it was we sort of started out big with a bunch of different ideas and then steadily narrowed it down to the final selection of works.
And Maeve, I was wondering if you could get into a little bit more of a detailed look at the process and the sort of theory of curating this exhibition, and how not only just how you described, Becca, selecting the works, but kind of what those curatorial conversations looked like in your group.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So I think something that this process really started with a lot of research, and our professor Anna Campbell did a really great job of pulling together all of these pieces of Michelle Handelman's career, but also reviews and writing about those videos. And so we weren't just viewing these videos totally out of context. We had an opportunity to read exhibition text or reviews from other installations of the work and think about, read conversations with the artist and some of the reception of the work as well. And so those were all things that we took into consideration to think about, how do these works relate? What is the artist's career? What's important to tell an audience about this artist and how they make work, how their career developed. So all of those things were a part of our process too. And that's something that that Anna Campbell did a really great job of helping us through. And that process of research, I think, is really important for the exhibition process and for curation, because you kind of do this like big deep dive into all of these big ideas and then attempt to distill it down into something that is digestible and that can go in this very small space. And we also really reacted to the architecture of the museum, because we read that that was something that Michelle Handelman herself does when she thinks about installation, but also the confines of screens and thinking about the audience of MMoCA and the space available to us with some restrictions because of the pandemic.
And for those of you who are unaware, I stated at the beginning, but these students curated the show as part of the Design Thinking for Exhibitions course, which means they spoke about process and development throughout the course. Can one of you take us through sort of what a classroom session looks like when you're formulating an exhibition as a group? What are those conversations like? And, you know, does everyone participate? How does that process work?
Yeah, I think so. The kind of we started off with this idea of what is design thinking and how to think about curation from the perspective of a designer. So research and collaboration, and then this idea of iteration and presenting to a public. So the first course was sort of, or the first part of the course was going through the IDEO design thinking manual, and then thinking about how these artworks would fit into that and how the exhibition process could be thought of in terms of this model of design thinking. And so a typical class session, honestly, there weren't any, because each of our class sessions were really different. Sometimes we screened work together as a group and we were in dialogue about those works that we screened. Sometimes we were working in small groups individually with partners to develop a specific proposal of a couple of works that we thought would be a really great version of this exhibition. And then we'd come together in a different class meeting and vote on those. So there was a lot of variety. In the last couple of weeks, we have been meeting in these small groups to produce different parts of work for the exhibition. So some people were working on creating social media posts that could be broadcast out to the group. Some people were writing catalog essays. Some people were doing exhibition design and graphic design for the exhibition. So depending on what your role was in the class and where we were in the semester, each class session was really different. And maybe Becca has something to say about their experience in the process too.
Yeah, I would add that it very much felt more like we were coworkers and colleagues than students in a class. Like much of our class time was spent on these very practical matters of writing, editing, brainstorming ideas, discussing ideas. Which of course you do all of that in an academic class too, but the class was very, very project oriented and really, in my opinion, developed some really important hands-on skills for doing museum work. We were split, and Maeve alluded to this, but we were split into 5 different committees that all had a different area of focus based on our interest. So we had a catalog essay committee, a design committee, a logistics committee, a media and PR committee, and a programming and outreach committee, which will sound familiar as sort of department titles that a lot of museums have. And then based on, and that we were split into those committees probably about halfway through the class. So each of us was working on specific tasks within our committees. Yeah, so it's definitely felt more of like a co-working space or like a colleague space than a typical academic course session might feel like.
I would absolutely agree with that. It's felt like actual museum work. And I think Becca and I had an interesting advantage of both having had some museum and exhibition experience before this, which is not the case for most of the class. And so I think can really speak to the utility of these skills and the direct translation from classroom to a museum or curatorial experience.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think it's important to note that the class is a mixture of graduate students and undergraduate students. So Maeve and I are both grad students, but I think it was actually a majority undergrad students in the course. If there had been a course like this at my undergraduate institution, I would have been thrilled and delighted to have such a sort of pre-professional hands-on experience as an undergraduate. I think is really invaluable.
Yeah, absolutely. These were experiences that I got as as a master's student through internships. And so to have this in a classroom setting and to have other students as your primary co-workers, I think is a really cool way to experience it and a really open and safe learning environment, I think, as well.
Yeah, that kind of gets into a question I would also be interested to hear from both of you about is, since you both have a little bit of curatorial experience and background, was this, any different than some of your other experiences curating or organizing shows? And if it was, how so? And also, how does that experience kind of represent itself when in a graduate or undergraduate, as the case may be, setting like this?
I can speak to that first. I mean, my primary other experience with curating has been like as a guest curator or a head curator on a project. So working in a committee and working collaboratively was a big change from that, and something that I think is a great like skill set to develop, obviously. I mean, in my other curatorial experiences, of course, you're collaborating across departments and you're collaborating with other museum professionals. But as Maeve mentioned, like collaborating in this way, all with other students, I think was a super unique part of the experience. And to be focused on a specific area I mean, we all started out with coming up with like exhibition proposals for the content, but once we split into all working on our separate committees, I think having that sort of hyper focus on one aspect of the project was also a sort of distinct part of this experience.
I think that's a good point, because I think normally you get a curatorial team and they're separate from programming or from social media. And so in this case, everyone did the curatorial research. You know, we all contributed to the vision. And so when people are writing for whatever space they're writing for, or thinking about events, we all have the same pool of information about the particular artworks, about the artist, and can all speak confidently to that. I think was something pretty unique. I think for me, my curatorial experience has been in at a historical society with decorative arts and with historic objects. So working with a living artist was also a new part of the experience for me. And I think I've had other interactions with artists as well, and worked with them in different ways. And so working with them towards an exhibition setting, and helping to understand, like, what's the curator's role? What is the artist's role, especially when that person is alive and has a clear vision of their work, of how they want it displayed, of what's important about the work. I think was a really great learning practice for me, but I think also for the class too, to think about, you know, where does our job stop? What is our job, like, to support and feature this artist? Because I think ideally, I guess in my opinion, the curator is sort of invisible, and it should be like distilling the artist's vision and the artist's work and maybe their biography, and stepping out of the way of that, or functioning as an interpreter for the audience. And so to work with other students to kind of get around that, because we were so many voices that ultimately our goal is to get out of the way at the same time, I think was an interesting part of the process in this format.
Yeah, I think that brings up an important thing that I wanted to mention earlier, that a hugely important part of the process was our studio visits with Michelle, and having Michelle be like a really active voice in the process, both at the research stage, you know, learning these this information about her work, about her process, about her inspiration that we otherwise may not have known from the studio visits, and then also getting her input on the design. Both of those aspects, I think, were really, really crucial to, as Maeve said, working with a living contemporary artist.
I think also she helped us see things that connected the works that maybe we hadn't, and ways in which she frames connections between the pieces. You know, she let us know that she saw a connection in the color blue, and that wasn't something that was on my radar, but that there are these visual cues and ways in which she's working that are separate from our kind of like thematic project. And that was really, really helpful and useful and great to be able to talk to somebody directly and say, what's going on here? Like, or, you know, what was your vision for this? How do these things relate?
Let's see, we have a question from a viewer. How many people were in the class, and was it conducted via the art department?
How many people are in it? Great question. I'm trying to envision our Zoom screen. Probably somewhere between 9 and 12 or something like that. Maeve, does that sound about right?
I think we had 4 graduate students, and then maybe 2 to 3 undergrads per graduate student.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this was not a part of my preparation for this interview. My apologies.
15, I would say, for sure. And the second part of the question, this course is offered as an art history course, not as an art department course, although clearly tons of overlap with, I think there are several students in the course who are practicing artists who are getting their degrees through the art department, but it is technically an art history course.
And, you know, you mentioned that you broke off into forming these separate committees that did kind of different things. I'd first of all be interested to hear which committees each of you were in, and then, you know, how did the collaboration within those groups sort of function? Like, for the committee that was perhaps formulating texts, how do you write a wall text collaboratively?
Well, I guess I wrote the wall text, so I can answer that question. I was a part of the logistics committee, and that sort of stemmed from my experience previously being in a curatorial department, but really thriving in a position that works collaboratively, that also has hands-on experience with art installation. I worked as a custom picture frame designer and an artist assistant before, and so thinking in terms of like the physical space and some of the logistics around that led to this logistics committee. I only had one other committee member. I know that there were other committees that had many more. I think the largest committee had 4 or 5 students in it. And I think that was actually the catalog committee, so doing the most writing. And I think each group probably worked differently because of the nature of the work. And I think Becca had a closer working relationship with her committee member than I did. But there was a lot of editing, some shared documents. We used online platforms to be able to see each other's works, to share documents back and forth. And that's one place, you know, that where this virtual moment definitely affected the workflow, because I think normally we would have been in a classroom working together at the same time in the same space. And so some of this was a little bit more remote and asynchronous than might have been otherwise. But Becca, maybe you can speak a little bit more to that process as well.
Yeah, so I was on the programming and outreach committee, and my interest in that stemmed from a lot of my work in between undergraduate and grad school was in public facing positions in museums, like visitor services type roles, and like the job I have now at MMoCA as a gallery assistant, or I think that's my title technically. So have always been really interested in thinking about how visitors connect with the work. And I think programming and outreach is a great way to build those connections and to offer different types of ways of connecting for museum visitors. I also was in a small committee. It was just me and one other student. And our process looked like a lot of Zoom calls and a lot of shared Google documents. We, in some cases, would split the project. So, for example, I am introducing Michelle at one of the CVC events next week, and Nicole is introducing Michelle at the other CVC event. And so we kind of wrote our introductions for that separately. But for the other event that we're working on, which is a screening of clips from Dorian, Dorian, A Cinematic Perfume is the full name. We selected those clips together and then collectively and collaboratively wrote the questions for the Q&A. So it's been, yeah, as Maeve said, a lot of the sort of work from home kind of classic virtual connecting. A lot of it has been done in tandem collaboratively, and then there's been a couple moments of kind of divide and conquer approach.
Yeah, that reminds me, Becca, too, that I think some of the experience I had was actually working with people on different committees, people in the media and PR committee about writing a press release. And so thinking about what language are we using? How do we share that language? Because I think when you're in an educational setting, there's a lot of emphasis placed on originality of both thought and language. And so most of the writing that students do, it's all unique. There's a lot of like, well, I don't want to take your words. And I think here, the focus on an attempt to find a unified voice that speaks for all of us, that is approachable to an audience. So thinking both about us as a collective, but also the audience experience was, I think, a big part of the work that I did, and thinking about how do we share, where do we say like, that's great, you should, take those 2 sentences from the beginning of the paragraph that I wrote, and you know what, I'm going to take this phrase that you used, and that helps us create a more unified set of texts across the different platforms on which they sat. I think that was a big part of it too.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I literally did that with the copy of the wall text that you wrote for the newsletter.
Yes.
I took like 3 sentences from that and transformed it into the event description that then got sent out on a bunch of different listservs. So there was collaboration across the departments as well, especially in terms of kind of sharing text and sharing language.
Yeah.
Well, let's move into a little bit more of the content of the exhibition and what's kind of included in these videos and the thoughts and ideas behind them. And to get us started on that subject matter, we actually do have a question from a viewer. I love the subtitle of the exhibition, Unruly and Ungovernable Selves. I'm wondering if crip theory or disability was woven into your thinking and programming. Also wondering if access, either physical or theoretical, was a component of the exhibition process, and if so, how?
That's such a great question. So the title comes from a work by Michelle. So she came up with that title. I love also the concept of an unruly or ungovernable self. I think is like a really rich idea.
It's also the title of one of the pandemic works. So that phrase was one that she had not come up just for the exhibition, but that is a title of a work, and so part of a very recent work, so part of the way in which the artist is thinking at this particular moment. Sorry to cut you off, Becca.
No, not at all. In terms of access, one of the things that actually Maeve and I were thinking a lot about was the actual space of the landing where the imprint gallery is. For those of you who have been to MMoCA, you know that there's like a enormous staircase that sort of defines the space. And then there's a smaller, sort of harder to find tucked away elevator that you can also use to access the upper floors. And so when we were thinking about the placement of the wall text for the exhibition, we wanted to make sure that it was equally serving and prioritizing folks who are using the staircase to access the second floor and folks who are using the elevator. So thinking about how can we not orient the exhibition just towards people who are coming up the staircase, but how can we orient it sort of equally to people who have different access and mobility needs as they move through the museum. And our solution to that was to put text in both locations so that no matter which way you enter the exhibition, you're getting that sort of welcoming experience of reading the text before you see the works.
We've got another question from a viewer. How different do you think the audience reaction will be since the pandemic series is on view entirely on the MMoCA website?
I think that also accommodates a set of viewer who might not be comfortable visiting the museum at the moment, that there is content to be viewed online. I think there's also a consideration for format of the artworks displayed. Irma Vep, The Last Breath, was originally designed as a multi-channel installation, formatted for a really large screen and for an architectural setting. And we've given that the largest space in the exhibition. In our studio visit with Michelle Handelman, we talked about her process and the materiality of some of these works, and about the screen as an object, and so the sort of the objecthood of these artworks, and that actually led to our curatorial decision to put a screen there, and to some of the choices that we made in artworks, I think was her emphasis on the objecthood. And these 3 videos that are created all within about the last year in response to the pandemic, those were formatted in part to be viewed online in a socially distanced way. And so they're in a place that is respectful of their format and the vision and the way in which they were designed and initially thought to be seen. So there's also attention to the artist's process, the ways in which all of these works are based in moving image, but they all have very different characters and very different material and physical presences.
Yeah, and I would add to that, there's something kind of self-reflexive about showing the pandemic series work online, because we all have been so submerged in viewing everything online, that there's something that feels fitting about watching these pieces that were created during the pandemic lockdown, in response to the lockdown and to COVID and to the aftermath and to the protests that have been happening during COVID. Because we've all been consuming so much content online and through screens, it feels like right in a weird way that those works we would also be watching online. And I would add, like, I'm so excited to see Irma Vep in the imprint gallery, because I've only ever seen Michelle's work on my laptop.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be a great experience for all of us in the class too, to actually to see her work in a different context as well. And I'm sure for different, I think the question had to do with how people will react. I think for some people, watching film on their laptop at home feels really comfortable and great. And for some people, going to a museum and watching films there feels really familiar and wonderful. So I think it'll definitely vary from viewer to viewer.
So let's get into the content and sort of the pandemic series itself as a starting off point. Can one of you walk us through the themes of that 3-piece series and the content of those videos for anyone who hasn't seen the work before?
Yeah, so the third one was actually just finished and just released. It's kind of premiering as a part of this exhibition. But the 3 parts, in Handelman's own words, relate to, the first one relates to lockdown, the second video relates to uprising, and the third video relates to aftermath. So they relate to different sort of phases of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the process that Michelle used is to go back into her own archival footage, and she describes it as sort of checking in on her characters. So she's checking in on characters from Dorian, from Irma Vep, from Hustlers and Empires, and thinking about how would they respond to what's happening right now? How would they react to this pandemic, to this lockdown, to the isolation, to the protests? And so she's recutting the footage that she already has had created for these other pieces, and also mixing it with text in a really exciting way, which was not a part of her earlier videos that we watched, to create a sort of very like emergent response to the contemporary moment, using her own characters and her own archival footage.
And obviously, as you described, the subject matter is very pertinent, but I would love to hear from you all why, as a group, why else you thought that this would be a good work or series of works to include in the exhibition, and how that kind of plays out in the format of this exhibition.
I was personally really interested in the process. I think Michelle spoke to us, and also in some of the interviews or the other writing that we read, about her collaborative process, working with a number of different artists, with her producer, and I think that's actually the wrong title. She works with somebody who does the cinematography for her, I believe. And how that has shaped her work and the way in which it's evolved because of these collaborations. She also talked a lot about the research she did into texts and visual themes, and that her process is really long. So there's this really long research process, and then she spends a long time shooting a film, and then she spends a really long time editing, and that it's really hard for her to cut things out, to remove. And so I think these are a really nice supplement to some of the other works, because they take either pieces that were in those films or pieces that didn't make it in. And it sort of is illustrative too of how she's working when she doesn't have access to community, to these collaborators. And so I think not only does it speak to her characters, and who are really rich and well developed in her films, but also to her and her process and how she thinks about both those characters and the actual, the narratives that she's able to develop through the footage that she shoots in this collaborative space.
Yeah, I think when we were all coming up with our different proposals, I think the pandemic series was like the most it was like every proposal that our fellow students sent in pretty much included the pandemic series. And I think, Lisa, it does have a lot to do with what you mentioned, is just it feels so pertinent to what's happening for all of us right now. I think there was also something exciting for people about the length of them. They're a little bit shorter than some of the other longer pieces, and we wanted to offer a variety of different lengths for viewers to engage with. And we kind of found out as a bonus that the third piece would be ready just in time for the show. So I think there was also something exciting about that as well.
And we saw the themes as being, I think Michelle Handelman's work deals a lot with with themes that are universal. And I think in particular, the pandemic series, we're very direct about, this is an experience that we as an audience have all had. And so we were hoping that these also will be a very direct way into her work and relatable, and would also time nicely with MMoCA's reopening as a reaction to the pandemic. So I think there were a lot of themes about connection and the ways in which audience members might have experienced some of the things that the intertitles in those works directly speak to as well.
Okay, let's move on to the work exhibited in the imprint gallery itself, Irma Vep, or The Last Breath. And in some ways, with a runtime of over half an hour and the placement of the work within the imprint gallery, it's almost the centerpiece of the exhibition. Would one of you mind walking us through sort of the content, themes of this work, and what it all entails for those who haven't seen it?
Maeve, do you want to do that, or should I?
I feel like you're better at this part, but I can also take it if you don't want to.
Well, I would say, so a huge part of Michelle's process is being inspired by other sort of pieces of culture, other films, literature. So Irma Vep was inspired by the film.
It's a serial film. I'll take it.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
I'm mixing it up now.
So Irma Vep is the name of a character in an early 20th century expressionist serial film about a group of robbers, and that character Irma Vep is sort of this the originator of the woman in the cat suit, and so she's this very old sort of figure of this like femme noir, and as a character was really fascinating for Michelle Handelman. There's also an element, the actress who played Irma Vep in that early 20th century film, she went by the name Musadora, and she was an actress who had a really interesting career and created this whole sort of like illusion around herself as this actress, but who later in life did not enjoy that same sense of fame or financial success that she had as a young actress. And so the story of Irma Vep, The Last Breath, parallels both the character in that film, but also that actress. And so we see those two characters portrayed. So Zachary Drucker plays Irma Vep, and Flawless Sabrina portrays the actress Musadora. Mm-hmm. And we see them kind of in relationship to each other, one later in life, one who's very young. there's a lot about personal identity, about the ability to express oneself or having to keep oneself undercover and hidden. As I mentioned earlier, Irma Vep was originally designed as a 4-channel installation. So it would have been portrayed on 4 different screens, kind of with action going on each of them all around. And I think you asked specifically about, it's a 30-minute piece. Are people going to see this in the imprint gallery? Are people going to sit with it? We talked before also about wanting to show films at a number of different lengths. And so I think this piece was also designed so that there are moments in it that are really immersive, that people can pick up on these themes about life, about being hidden, about expressing oneself, about mortality, at any given moment in the film in which they walk into it. And you get a sense of Handelman's aesthetic, you get a sense of the story, even if it's a bit disjointed, that there's something that the sort of piecemeal part of it is not a detractor. It's part of the artwork and is part of the experience, I think, of seeing Michelle Handelman's work, that there's this sense of almost overstimulation, but of immersion as well in her work.
Yeah, and I would add, you mentioned it stars Zachary Drucker and Flawless Sabrina, who are both artists and performers in their own right. And that is a huge part of Michelle's process, is collaborating with other artists and performers, bringing them into her work. There's a lot of improvisation that happens, like some of the monologues in Irma Vep are improvised by the actors with sort of prompts from Handelman. So a big part of her process is collaborating and working sort of hand in hand with her performers.
And one aspect of that work that I think is really central, and I'd be interested to hear a bit more from you about, from both of you about, is the sort of gender dynamics that are present in that piece. And, Michelle herself described the void that is Irma Vep as a space between the genders. And I think you really get a sense of that watching the piece. So would one of you or both of you like to speak to those gender dynamics that play such a central role in this piece?
Yeah, I mean, so Zachary Drucker is a trans woman who's famous for their role on Transparent. Flawless Sabrina is a drag queen. So a lot of, and something that I've noticed in watching Handelman's work is there really is this like visual language of queerness and drag throughout her work. So there's a lot of body glitter and fake eyelashes and all sorts of these very like kind of over the top, very expressive costume elements that for me as a queer person really relate to queerness, to performance, to those kind of spaces of performed queer identity like drag that Flawless Sabrina was a part of. The characters, one of the main sort of recurring scenes in Irma Vep is Irma, who's played by Zachary Drucker, is basically in therapy and is sort of mulling over their life and all of these big sort of themes of loneliness, of criminality, of being hidden. A lot of the statements that come out of those scenes for me are especially powerful in conjunction with Zachary's identity as a trans woman, and feel really sort of activated and dynamic because of that. So, I mean, I would say gender and queerness are really central to all of Handelman's works, including in Irma Vep. I don't know, Maeve, if you have anything you'd like to add to that as well.
No, I'd absolutely agree. I think your point about some of the things like costume and makeup or false eyelashes, I think we also see a little bit in Candyland, and we see, I can't remember if we see these exact characters, but we see those same tools in the pandemic works as well. And so I think the gender that is expressed in Irma Vep, we see explored as well in the other works, but I think that this particular piece really centers it in a way, and exposes that. You see, I think, for example, Flawless Sabrina in a number of stages of dress or undress. So you see kind of both sides of the drag queen there. I think that's it.
And I would add to that too. I mean, a thing that you brought up earlier, Maeve, is this theme of like being undercover. So in the film, Irma Vep is part of like a street gang, basically, who's like committing crimes. And a lot of what she reflects on is being undercover or working covertly. I think that is an experience that a lot of trans people share. Not all, of course, but I think that there is definitely a parallel between the sort of relationship with crime and the relationship with gender that's on view in the film.
Yeah, I think she also speaks a lot about her romantic relationship and power dynamics there too, about, what one does, when one is in a relationship that might not be a good fit or is unhealthy, or where they feel they can express themselves, that those are also a part of the narrative and the dialogue as well.
Well, the final work in this show that we haven't touched on specifically is Candyland, which is on view on the monitor on the second floor landing at MMoCA. And this is an older piece made in 1999, a little older than the other works included in this exhibition. So can one of you explain about why that work found its way into this show and sort of speak to, again, the content, themes, performative elements of that piece?
Yeah, when we spoke to Michelle, she was really excited about the idea of an exhibition that spanned across the different decades of her work rather than just showing more recent works. So I was, in my proposals, was definitely pretty determined to include some of the earlier works. And a lot of her earlier works feature herself as a sort of single subject with a fisheye camera lens trained on herself, often repeating a repetitive action over and over and over again. So Candyland fits into that sort of group of her earlier works, and it features Michelle eating candy off the floor, and that's the sort of single action that takes place across the loop of the film. For me, I was really excited by so the street gang in Irma Vep is called the Vampires. There's some like blood sucking that happens in the film. I was really excited about this connection of consumption, and also thinking about in Dorian, which is the piece that we'll be screening clips from, there's a lot about sort of overconsumption, about drugs and alcohol. So I was interested in thinking that connection by showing these works together. As Maeve mentioned, there's a beautiful sort of color resonance between the two works. Like they formally look really, really nice together. And they show, I would say, very different sort of eras of Michelle's work, from this sort of, as an artist whose work is rooted in live performance and performance art, which is demonstrated by Candyland. And then these very sort of like slick, very filmic videos that have a very different sort of quality of production about them, that's embodied by Irma Vep. So they're very different in a lot of ways to sort of show the span of her career. But I do think that they bring out exciting tensions and shared themes in each other.
Yeah. I think for me, what I was really, Candyland is a part of a larger series of work called Cannibal Garden. And being a product of the late 90s, early 2000s, at the time, Michelle Handelman was really exploring what is digital mediation. And so this exposed fisheye lens that Becca's speaking about is definitely it's a physical part of the image. I think she was also using some of the visual language of anime or sci-fi in this series. And so there's this exploration of otherness through contemporary culture, through pop culture, and thinking about digital mediation. We see some of the editing in that film is like, it's kind of like hidden a little bit. So there's this constant consumption in a way that's sort of not possible except through digital mediation. And so for me, these themes really relate to some of the isolation, this digital moment that we're feeling as we're all like right now on the other side of a camera and a screen. And so that work, in addition to the pandemic works, I think there's a resonance between those as well, and to this current moment when we're thinking about who's viewing us, how are we viewing us, are we performing for the camera, are we performing for ourselves or for our audience, and that is a big part of what is going on in Candyland as well, and something that I think, even though the film is, or the artwork is older, it is very relevant to this current moment and the experience we're all having, mediated through screens.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about how the sort of presence of the camera is emphasized. I think that's also true in Dorian, which we'll be showing clips of. For me, it was also important to show Candyland, or one of the earlier works, because a lot of the earlier works are very like uncomfortable. Like they make, they're kind of like, there's these gross actions taking place. There's this really disorienting sound. There's often like very close up to the camera faces. And I feel like that effect on the viewer is a really important part of Michelle's work. And I wanted to make sure that we had some part of her large body of work that spoke to that, and that had that sort of disorienting effect on the viewer, to make sure that was included in the exhibition as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's another piece in that series, Cannibal Garden, where in a performance, Handelman herself says to the camera, "I exist in a state of constant overstimulation." And I think that is also a part of her aesthetic, is this kind of constant movement, discomfort, visual disorientation. And because of the space of the imprint gallery, we're seeing Irma Vep as a single channel film. And so where we might have got some of that physical discomfort from that piece in a different form, I think Candyland helps us bring that element in the single channel in a way that I think Irma Vep moves away from because of the way that it was designed. And I think this physical experience is also a huge part of that discomfort and the change that we're experiencing as well.
Well, I've got a final question here tonight for both of you. You know, as you both have touched on in the last few minutes, the works in this exhibition are all very unique and very different, but I'm interested to hear from both of you what you would speak to as maybe a unifying theme of the exhibition, or a curatorial thesis of all of these works, and how do these disparate pieces end up cohering into one singular exhibition?
I'm really excited to see what the catalog committee has to say about that. I mean, for me, a lot of the connection is around the visual language that Michelle uses. So what I spoke about earlier, this visual language of queerness and of excess, and themes that also have to do with queerness, anti-conformity, so and thinking about gender. So for me, that is one of the central themes of the work, but I also study queer contemporary art. So of course, that's what I'm going to see in the work. But that's what comes out of it for me.
Yeah, I think that's really great. I think for me, I think there are also themes of universality that, as much as some of the subject matter is very specific to queer community, it doesn't mean it's not accessible to other audiences, and that these ideas about our bodies, about life, about truth of self, I think, is a big part of it. I think that relating all of these things to the current moment, to how we're thinking and feeling today. I think there's this sort of like deep smoke that appears in Irma Vep, and so it's called The Last Breath, and so there's this focus on breathing. I think the digital mediation in Candyland and the pandemic films being in response to this very present moment. I think for me, I was thinking about how do we relate to this, how our, because themes have an intent, or artworks have an intended theme or purpose, but they also are constantly able to be reinterpreted in reaction to the moment and to the audience, and they mean something different in each setting that they're in. And so pulling out how these things relate to our current moment, how our moment relates to those in the past. I think we spoke a lot about Michelle Handelman's reaction to the AIDS crisis, and to another moment where a virus was very present in a community, and that was something that was set aside and sheltered, and it's something that we've all experienced. Now, that's not the best way to say that, I apologize. I think that these themes of universality are a big part of it as well.
Well, that's a great note to end on. And I would like to just extend my deepest appreciation to Becca and Maeve for both joining us here tonight and speaking excellently to the show and its themes and your process. A big thank you as well to Simone Doing and Kelsey Knudsen for the technical coordination. Thank you to Charlotte Cummins for her introduction. And just as a reminder, Michelle Handelman, These Unruly and Ungovernable Selves, will be on view through August 15th in the imprint gallery at MMoCA and on our website at mmoca.org. So please make sure to check it out. Thank you all for watching and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.